Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Eric Forrester had spent his entire life erecting conglomerates, nurturing gift, and watching generations of his family rise and fall within the walls of Forrester Creations. He'd seen love turn into contest, fidelity turn into treason, and ambition destroy connections that formerly sounded unbreakable. But nothing had prepared him for the strange, uncomfortable position he now set up himself in, working under Katie Logan's direction. It wasn't that he disliked Katie. In fact, he admired her intelligence, her professionalism, and her determination. But the power dynamic felt wrong. Forrester Creations had always been his heritage, his vision, his world. Now, every decision he made felt like it needed blessing from someone who was into Forrester by blood. And the pressure between him and Ridge only made effects worse. Eric felt like a guest in his own house, a legend reduced to a supporting part in a story he formerly wrote himself. The atmosphere in the design office had changed. Where horse laugh and creative energy formerly filled the air, there was now a turnabout of apprehension. Eric noticed how people spoke more precisely around him, how meetings felt more rigid, more controlled. He wasn't the commanding presence he used to be. He was admired, yes, but not deified. And that soaked further than he watched to admit. Katie, in her part, had been firm, organized, and effective. But to Eric, her leadership style felt cold. It demanded the warmth and instinct that had formerly defined the Forrester brand. Fashion wasn't just about figures and schedules. It was about passion, vision, and heart. And recently, Eric felt like that heart was being ignored. What hurt indeed more was Ridge's station. His own son, the man he'd guided and trusted for decades, sounded distant, guarded, and decreasingly aligned with the new leadership. Ridge wasn't openly discourteous, but there was a conspicuous shift in the way he spoke to Eric. Lower discussion, smaller private exchanges, further commercial language, lower family connection. Eric could smell it. Ridge was choosing sides, and Eric wasn't on the winning one. The final straw came during a tense boardroom meeting. Eric had proposed a bold cultural direction for a forthcoming collection, commodity classic, commodity that recognized the roots of the Forrester name. Katie heeded politely, but her response was firm and impersonal. She emphasized budgets, timelines, and request trends. Her decision was final. The collection would follow a further marketable approach. No debate. No concession. Eric sat there in silence, his jaw tight, his pride wounded. In that moment he realized commodity had to change. Latterly that day, Eric stood alone in his office, gaping at the framed prints on the wall, recollections of triumph, family, and love. This company was further than a business to him. It was his life's work. And he wasn't willing to watch it come commodity unrecognizable. He picked up the phone and asked Katie to meet him intimately. When Katie arrived, she could incontinently smell the soberness in Eric's address. His posture was rigid, his expression undecipherable. He didn't desolate time with small talk. He told her plainly he was tired of feeling sidelined in the company he erected. He was tired of creative opinions being reduced to spreadsheets. He was tired of the growing distance between himself and his own son. He conceded her capability, her fidelity, and her leadership, but he also made it clear that commodity was unnaturally wrong. Also, he delivered the claim. Still, two conditions had to be met if he was going to continue working under Katie's authority. First, Eric demanded full creative freedom over his own designs. He wasn't asking to run the entire company again. He wasn't challenging her leadership. But when it came to his collections, his cultural vision would not be overruled. No more commercial hindrance. No more creative restrictions. His designs would reflect the soul of Forrester Creations, not just request data. Alternate, Eric claimed on restoring translucency and respect within the family. That meant open communication with Ridge, real exchanges, not filtered commercial conversations. He wanted assurance that family values still signified in the company his family built. However, it couldn't just be a business. If Forrester Creations was going to survive, it had to remain a family heritage. Katie heeded precisely, her expression thoughtful. She hadn't anticipated such a direct battle, but she understood the emotional weight behind his words. Eric wasn't just speaking as in hand. He was speaking as an author, a father, and a man who had given everything to this company. She admitted that the transition in leadership had been delicate for everyone, including Ridge. The pressure to keep the company competitive had led to opinions that may have unintentionally pushed Eric to the sidelines. Katie promised to consider his conditions seriously. She didn't want to lose Eric, not as a developer, not as a leader, and not as a symbol of what Forrester Creations stood for. When Ridge latterly learned about the claim, it hit him harder than he anticipated. He'd been so focused on steering the company forward that he hadn't realized how important his father felt left before. Guilt crept by. Eric wasn't just a fabulous developer. He was his father. And Ridge knew he'd let the commercial world intrude with their relationship. That night, Ridge went to see Eric. Not as a CEO, not as a developer, but as a son. The discussion wasn't easy. There were times of implied pressure, misconstructions, and emotional distance to unpack. Eric expressed how painful it was to feel inapplicable in the company he erected. Ridge admitted he'd been hysterical of losing control, hysterical of the company failing, hysterical of making the wrong opinions. Nearly along the way, he'd forgotten that his father was still his topmost supporter. The two conditions Eric had set weren't just about business. They were about respect, heritage, and family. By the end of the night, commodity had shifted. There was no dramatic resolution, no instant fix. But there was understanding. And for the first time in a long while, Eric felt heard. The coming day, Katie made her decision. She agreed to Eric's conditions. His creative freedom would be defended. His voice would count. And the company would make a renewed trouble to prioritize family communication alongside commercial success. Eric didn't walk down. But he made it clear the days of being quietly sidelined were over. Forrester Creations would move forward, but it would do so with its author's heart still beating at the center of it all. The days following Eric Forrester's claim were thick with implied pressure, the kind that dallied in the air long after meetings ended and services voided. Forrester Creations continued to operate like a well-waxed machine on the face. Contrivers sketching, sidekicks rushing between departments, directors reviewing reports, but underneath it all, commodity abecedarian had shifted. Eric's demand for creative freedom and restored family respect had cracked open injuries that had been still spoiling for times. People felt it in the way Ridge avoided certain exchanges, in the way Katie broke before making opinions, and in the way Eric himself walked through the halls with a renewed sense of authority, no longer willing to be unnoticeable in the company he erected from nothing. Eric wasn't trying to reclaim power for the sake of pride. He wanted to reclaim purpose. Every morning he arrived earlier than usual, stepping into his design plant with the same fire he'd had decades ago when Forrester Creations was still a dream rather than a global brand. His sketches were bolder, his fabrics richer, his vision unapologetically classic. He wasn't chasing trends presently. He was defining them again. Sidekicks noticed the change. Contrivers rumored about how the old Eric was back. There was energy in his movements, conviction in his choices, and most importantly, confidence in his voice. He wasn't asking for authorization presently. He was creating. Katie, on the other hand, set up herself in strange home. Leadership had always come naturally to her. She was decisive, organized, and concentrated on results. But Eric's claim forced her to review what leadership really meant in a family-run conglomerate. Forrester Creations wasn't just another commercial reality, it was a heritage. And patrimonies came with emotional weight, history, and prospects that couldn't be measured in profit perimeters alone. She admired Eric, but now she had to truly understand him. That meant hearkening not just to what he said, but to what he felt. In private moments, Katie replayed their discussion in her mind. The disappointment in Eric's eyes hadn't been about control. It had been about being seen, being valued, being flashed back. She realized that in her trouble to stabilize the company, she may have unintentionally pushed away the very soul of the brand. That consummation didn't make her weaker, it made her more thoughtful. And thoughtful leaders made better opinions. Ridge was floundering in his own way. He'd spent times balancing ambition with fidelity, trying to prove he could lead without his father's shadow. But now that shadow felt less like a burden and more like a missing piece. He'd wanted to contemporize Forrester Creations, to keep it competitive in a ruthless fashion assiduity, but nearly along the line modernization had turned into emotional distance. His father didn't need to be replaced. He demanded to be admired. Late one evening, Ridge wandered into Eric's design plant, chancing him alone, girdled by fabric tapes and untreated sketches. The room smelled of leather, essay and history. Ridge didn't say important at first. He just watched his father work the same way he'd as a child. Eric's hands were steady, his focus unwavering. For a moment time sounded to rewind. Ridge eventually spoke, not as an superintendent but as a son. He admitted he'd been hysterical of losing control, hysterical of failure, hysterical of getting inapplicable himself. Eric heeded still, not interposing, not judging. When Ridge finished, Eric simply jounced. He understood fear. He'd lived with it his entire life. Erecting an conglomerate wasn't easy. Guarding one was indeed harder. What Eric wanted wasn't dominance. He wanted collaboration. He wanted his experience to matter. He wanted Ridge to trust him the way he formerly had. That night didn't magically fix everything, but it planted a seed of mending. Meanwhile, the staff at Forrester Creations began to notice subtle changes in leadership dynamics. Meetings felt less rigid. Creative conversations came more open. Eric's ideas were no longer brushed away, they were explored, batted, and frequently embraced. Katie encouraged dialogue rather than decreeing issues. Ridge began seeking his father's input again, not out of obligation, but out of respect. The company felt more alive. But not everyone was comfortable with this shift. Some directors bothered that Eric's creative freedom would disrupt precisely planned strategies. Others stressed that emotional decision timber could weaken the company's competitive edge. The fashion world was brutal, and saccharine had no place in business, or so they believed. But Forrester Creations had no way been erected on cold effectiveness alone. It had been erected on passion, threat, and bold vision. Eric embodied all three. As his new collection began to take shape, excitement buzzed through the halls. The designs were elegant, important, and unmistakably Forrester. They told a story of heritage, adaptability, and dateless beauty. Fashion critics were formerly brooding about a Forrester renaissance. Eric felt proud, not just of the clothes but of the communication behind them. This wasn't about nostalgia. It was about elaboration without erasure. Katie stood in the exchange one autumn, watching models walk in Eric's designs. The fabrics flowed like liquid confidence, each piece carrying a sense of history without feeling outdated. She realized commodity important Eric's creativity was into trouble to progress. It was the foundation of it. But indeed, as professional harmony sluggishly returned, particular pressures still coddled beneath the face. Ridge plotted with guilt. He'd spent so important time trying to prove himself that he forgot who had tutored him everything. Eric plotted with vulnerability. Admitting he felt pushed away hadn't been easy. And Katie plotted with balance, trying to lead forcefully without losing the heart of the company. The emotional weight of the claim continued to ripple through the family. One evening, Eric set up himself alone at the Forrester estate, walking through the quiet halls filled with recollections. Every print, every piece of cabinetwork told a story. Brooke, Stephanie, Ridge as a child, the innumerous triumphs and dolor that had shaped his life. He wasn't just guarding a company. He was guarding a heritage of love, loss, and perseverance. For the first time in a long while, Eric felt at peace. He hadn't walked down. He hadn't surrendered. He'd stood his ground with quality, and it changed everything. Ridge began involving Eric in long-term planning again, not as an emblematic gesture, but as a strategic move. Katie started consulting Eric on creative branding, fating that his instincts still reverberated with the core of the Forrester identity. The company came stronger not by silencing its history, but by recognizing it. Yet, the fashion world no way sleeps, and challenges were formerly forming on the horizon. Rival houses were watching nearly. Any sign of internal conflict could be exploited. The stakes were advanced than ever. Eric knew this, but he also knew commodity differently. Forrester Creations was no way at its stylish when it played it safe. It thrived on bold moves, emotional pitfalls, and intrepid vision. And Eric Forrester was done playing games. He'd reclaimed his voice, his purpose, and his place not through power but through presence. The claim was "ent an ending." It was a morning. As weeks passed, the emotional foreshocks of Eric Forrester's claim continued to ripple through every corner of Forrester Creations. The structure itself sounded to carry the weight of undetermined history, with its satiny glass walls reflecting not just the megacity skyline, but decades of ambition, immolation, and family drama. While business carried on, the emotional climate inside the company remained fragile. Eric had reclaimed his creative authority, but reclaiming emotional trust, especially with Ridge, proved to be a far more complicated battle. Eric threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. Each design felt particular, as though he were suturing his own life story into every confluence. His plant became a sanctuary again, a place where he felt in control, inspired, and admired. Youngish contrivers frequently stopped by just to watch him work, drawn to the quiet confidence he carried. He was loud. He was demanding. But his presence commanded attention. His heritage was written in words. It was woven into fabric, figure, and style. Still, beneath that calm surface, Eric felt the pang of undetermined distance with his son. Ridge had made sweats to reconnect, but the exchanges remained careful, nearly guarded. Times of professional contest and emotional misreading couldn't be undone overnight. Eric wanted further than polite respect, he wanted genuine connection. He wanted Ridge to flash back what it meant to be a Forrester, not just a CEO. Katie, meanwhile, walked a delicate line. She admired Eric's part in his history, but she also carried the responsibility of keeping the company profitable in an decreasingly competitive assiduity. Fashion trends shifted briskly than ever, and investors were watching nearly. Any sign of internal insecurity could hang the brand's future. Katie was hysterical of Eric's creative vision. She stressed what undetermined family conflict could do to the company's character. Behind unrestricted doors, Katie frequently reflected on the difference between leadership and authority. Authority came from a title. Leadership came from trust. And trust, she realized, couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. Ridge, caught between fidelity to his father and responsibility to the company, felt like he was walking a tightrope. Every decision carried emotional consequences. However, he risked losing applicability if he leaned too far into tradition. However, he risked losing his father if he leaned too far into modernization. The weight of anticipation pressed down on him, and for the first time, he began to understand how heavy that weight must have been for Eric all those times. Late one evening, Ridge set up himself alone in the Forrester design libraries, girdled by sketches dating back decades. Each delineation told a story of dreams, pitfalls, and moments that defined the company's rise. He traced his fritters over his father's early work, feeling a surge of nostalgia mixed with remorse. Eric hadn't just directed a fashion house. He directed a heritage that Ridge was still floundering to recognize in his own way. Across the megacity, Eric sat still in his living room, gaping at an old family print. It showed Ridge as a boy, standing proudly beside him at one of Forrester's foremost fashion shows. Back also, Ridge had looked at him with pure admiration. No competition. No pressure. Just pride. Eric missed that interpretation of their relationship the bone. That was before business complicated everything. When Ridge eventually gathered the courage to visit Eric again, the atmosphere was different from ahead. There was lower formality, lower distance. They talked about the early days of Forrester Creations, about miscalculations, pitfalls, and the assignments learned along the way. Eric spoke actually about his fears, about growing, about getting inapplicable, about watching his life's work slip out of his hands. Ridge heeded, truly heeded, for the first time in times. The discussion didn't break everything, but it softened the emotional peak. At Forrester Creations, Eric's new collection began to gain attention beyond the company walls. Assiduity interposers praised its authenticity, calling it a return to dateless fineness. Buyers expressed interest, and social media buzzed with excitement. The success of the line validated Eric's creative instincts and strengthened his position within the company. Katie conceded the impact intimately, giving Eric credit during a major press meeting. Her words weren't just professional, they were regardful. For Eric, that recognition signified further than deals figures. It meant his voice still carried weight, but success frequently attracts pressure. Rival fashion houses began studying Forrester's moves nearly. Rumors circulated about implicit appropriations, competitive launches, and aggressive marketing strategies aimed at challenging the Forrester brand. Internally, directors bothered that any hint of family conflict could weaken their request position. Eric understood this.